The rain poured steadily over the sprawling grounds of Ravenshade Manor, a grand estate that stood like a shadowed crown at the edge of the world. The gravel driveway twisted through ancient oaks, their branches bending low as though whispering secrets only the wind could understand. Inside one of the upper rooms, Clara Evans pressed her palm against the frosted glass and watched the storm roll in. It had been years since she had seen rain like this, wild, cleansing, and alive. There was something about the way the world seemed to pause under such a sky that comforted her. In her small and quiet life, she had learned to find meaning in stillness. The world had not always been kind to her, but silence had. It gave her a place to hide, a place to heal, a place to start over when the noise of heartbreak grew too loud to bear. Clara had come to Ravenshade only 3 months ago, a sanctuary for those seeking work and peace away from the chaos of cities and crowds. She had been hired as a caretaker for the gardens and the guest quarters, though she often found herself helping in the kitchen, mending curtains, or tending to the old manor's library that smelled faintly of leather and dust. She loved the solitude, the way the sunlight fell through the tall windows each morning and how the woods hummed with life just beyond the hedges. For someone who had known the ache of abandonment since childhood, the manor felt like a strange miracle, quiet, safe, forgiving. But that morning, something unusual stirred the routine stillness. From the corner of her eye, Clara saw a sleek black car appear through the mist, a rare sight in this secluded corner of the countryside. It glided up the long path, scattering puddles of rainwater in its wake. She frowned slightly, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. Visitors rarely came to Ravenshade, and those who did were often guests seeking retreat, not arriving unannounced in vehicles that looked like they belonged to another world entirely. When the car finally stopped, the driver stepped out first, a tall man in a dark coat. He moved with a kind of calm authority that made even the rain seem hesitant to fall upon him. The moment he straightened, the world seemed to adjust around him, as though the air itself recognized who he was. Adrian Blackwood. The name echoed silently in Clara's mind, before she even realized she had heard it whispered once before by the manor's caretaker. Billionaire, philanthropist, business magnate, and a man who had vanished from public life 3 years ago after a scandal the newspapers still speculated about. No one knew where he had gone or why. Some said he had lost everything that mattered to him. Others said he had grown weary of the greed and betrayal that followed fortune. Whatever the truth, it seemed that the storm had finally brought him here. Adrian stood there for a moment, staring at the manor's tall windows with a look that carried both nostalgia and weariness. His eyes were a deep shade of gray, storm-touched like the clouds above, and though his posture was poised, there was a heaviness in his movements, as if he carried an invisible weight. Clara hesitated near the entryway, torn between curiosity and the instinct to retreat. There was something in his presence that felt both commanding and fragile, like the calm before thunder. When their eyes met for the first time, the moment stretched, a silent recognition of two souls who had both lost more than they were willing to admit. "Good afternoon," Clara finally said, her voice soft but steady as she opened the door against the wind. "You must be Mr. Blackwood. We've been expecting you." Adrian gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "So it seems," he replied, his voice low and rich, tinged with exhaustion. "I hope I'm not interrupting your peace." "Not at all," she said, stepping aside. "Please come in out of the rain." The scent of rain followed him as he entered the grand hall, oak, leather, and faint traces of salt from the storm. His gaze wandered slowly across the high ceilings and chandeliers, the tapestries faded by time, and the flickering warmth of the fireplace that cast golden reflections across the marble floor. It was clear that Ravenshade was not a place of luxury anymore, but one of quiet resilience, a home built from history, not ambition. "Beautiful place," he murmured. "Old but alive," Clara smiled softly. "It has a way of choosing the people who need it most." He looked at her then, something sharp yet searching in his expression. "And who chose you?" The question caught her off guard, and for a heartbeat she couldn't answer. She thought of the past, the foster homes, the years spent working in small cafes, the heartbreak of dreams left unfinished. But she only said, "Maybe I chose myself." Adrian nodded, and there was the faintest hint of respect in his eyes. "That's harder than most people realize." As the day faded into dusk, the storm softened into a steady drizzle. Clara showed Adrian to his room, the West Wing suite that overlooked the wild gardens and the distant hills. He said little, but she could tell from the way his hand lingered on the banister or the way he paused before certain portraits that he was not a stranger to solitude. When she brought him a tray of tea and bread later, she noticed a leather journal resting on the desk, open to a page with a single unfinished line. When the world took everything, I forgot what it meant to be human. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Clara sat by the fire in the kitchen, turning those words over in her mind. She didn't know his story, but she recognized the kind of pain that wrote such sentences. It was the language of someone trying to rebuild from the ashes. She wondered if he saw her that way too, a woman made of quiet endurance rather than strength. Over the following days, their paths crossed more often. Sometimes in the garden where Adrian walked in silence among the rain-drenched roses, sometimes in the library, where he stood by the windows reading letters from his past that no one else would ever see, and though he rarely spoke when he did, his words carried a depth that seemed to anchor her. It wasn't romance. Not yet, and it was something older, something sacred, like two souls remembering what it felt like to trust. One morning, she found him standing by the cliff's edge beyond the estate, staring at the gray horizon where the sea met the clouds. He looked utterly lost, a man who had conquered everything but himself. She hesitated, then approached quietly. "You shouldn't stand too close," she said gently. "The wind is unpredictable here." He turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes I think that's the point." The words chilled her, not because they were dark, but because they were honest. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you came here to disappear, Mr. Blackwood, you chose the wrong place. Ravenshade doesn't let people vanish. It makes them remember who they are." For a long moment he said nothing. Then his gaze softened and a rare smile ghosted across his lips. "And what about you, Clara Evans? What did it make you remember?" She held his eyes and answered quietly, that even broken things can still be beautiful. It was in that moment that something shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but like the first quiet bloom of spring beneath the snow. He looked at her differently after that, not as an employee, but as someone who carried her own kind of grace. And she, against her better judgment, began to see in him not the billionaire who had lost everything, but the man who might still find himself again. That evening, as the sunset painted the manor in gold and amber light, Adrian found her in the library again.
He stood by the door for a while before speaking.
"Clara," he said softly, "when I arrived here I thought I wanted silence. I thought peace meant forgetting. But today when you spoke to me by the cliffs, I realized peace isn't the absence of pain. It's learning to live through it." Her heart ached at the honesty in his tone. "You're learning faster than most." He smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Only because someone reminded me that beauty still exists." For a long time neither spoke. The fire crackled, the air hummed with warmth, and in the golden quiet of that moment, the first thread of something extraordinary began to form. Something that neither wealth nor power could ever buy. Outside, the rain began again, soft and rhythmic as though the world itself was breathing with relief. Clara closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere deep within, she knew this was only the beginning, not of a love that saved them, but of one that made them worthy of saving themselves. The days that followed drifted through Ravenshade like the slow turning of a forgotten melody, the kind that lingered long after the last note faded. The rain had finally surrendered to sunlight, and with it came a fragile sense of renewal that neither Adrian nor Clara could quite name. The manor seemed to breathe differently now, its windows brighter, its halls warmer, and its once quiet air carrying the faint hum of life returning to forgotten corners. Clara found herself rising earlier each morning, her steps light as she tended to the gardens, pruning the vines that curled around the fountain like wild poetry. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, unaware that from the tall window of his suite, Adrian watched her sometimes with an expression that wavered between admiration and guilt. Adrian Blackwood was a man of contradictions. The world had once seen him as invincible, a self-made billionaire whose name commanded power and whose empire stretched across continents. Yet behind the veneer of success had lived a man haunted by ghosts of choices that had cost him everything he once believed in. 3 years ago, his company had faced an investigation that left his reputation bruised and his heart hollow. Friends turned to strangers, promises to lies and love. if he had ever known it truly, or evaporated like mist in sunlight. When he came to Ravenshade, he told himself it was for peace, for isolation, for an ending. But as he watched Clara move through the sunlight, unguarded and unaware, he began to wonder if perhaps it was for a beginning he hadn't dared hope for. Clara was not the kind of woman who filled silence with noise. She was quiet, but not out of fear. Her quiet was the kind that held wisdom, like the stillness of water that reflected everything around it. She never asked about his past, though she could feel the weight of it in the pauses between his words. Instead, she spoke to him about the world beyond money and ambition, about the simple joy of tending soil, of seeing something grow, of believing that broken things could bloom again if given light. He found himself drawn to her presence the way a weary traveler might be drawn to the warmth of a distant fire. She reminded him of something he had forgotten, that not everything valuable could be owned, and not every scar needed to be hidden. One afternoon, the two of them found themselves in the greenhouse that stood behind the manor, a place filled with sunlight and the faint scent of earth and rosemary. Adrian had offered to help her repot the plants, though it was clear from the way he handled the tools that he was more accustomed to signing contracts than working with soil. She watched him struggle with a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You're holding the trowel like it's a weapon," she teased softly, brushing soil from her hands. "You'll frighten the plants that way." He looked up, mock offense flickering in his eyes. "I'm used to dealing with mergers, not marigolds. They don't exactly prepare you for this in business school." Clara laughed, and the sound filled the glass house with something bright and alive. "Maybe they should," she said gently. "You might have fewer men chasing power and more learning to plant something real." Her words lingered in the air between them, quiet but powerful. Adrian set the trowel down and looked at her for a long moment. The sunlight fell across her face, catching the warmth in her eyes, and for the first time in years he felt something in him shift, the frozen edges of his heart beginning to thaw. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you talk as if you've never wanted anything beyond this place. Haven't you ever dreamed of more?" She paused, her hand still on the soil, and looked out through the glass panes where sunlight poured through like liquid gold. "I used to," she said after a moment. "When I was younger, I thought life was something you had to chase. Success, love, meaning. But the more I chased, the more it ran away from me. Somewhere along the line, I realized peace isn't about what you reach for. It's about what you're willing to let go." Adrian exhaled slowly, her words sinking into him like truth long forgotten. He envied her, not because she had little, but because she needed little. She had built a life from fragments, while he had built an empire that no longer meant anything. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to confess, not to justify, not to impress, but to be understood. He leaned against the wooden table, his gaze distant. "Do you know why I came here, Clara?" She turned toward him, sensing the gravity in his tone. "I thought you came to rest," she said softly. He shook his head, a bitter smile curving his lips. "No, I came here because I couldn't forgive myself. I had everything a man could want, as money, power, recognition, but I lost the only thing that mattered. I let greed make me blind. I trusted the wrong people, hurt the right ones, and by the time I realized what I'd become, it was too late. My company survived, but I didn't. I thought if I disappeared, maybe the world would forget me. Maybe I'd forget myself too." There was silence then, the kind that wrapped around them like a living thing. Clara didn't speak right away. She simply stepped closer, her eyes full of empathy, not pity. "You can't heal by hiding, Adrian," she said finally. "The world doesn't forgive those who vanish. It forgives those who rise again, different this time." He looked at her, startled by the steadiness of her voice. "And what if I don't know how?" "Then start small," she said simply. "Forgive yourself for surviving." Her words broke something open inside him. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the sound of a lock turning after years of rust. For the first time since the downfall, he felt the possibility of redemption flicker like light through cracks in a wall. He realized then that Clara wasn't just another person passing through his life. She was a mirror, reflecting not what he was, but what he could still become. That evening he found her by the lake that bordered the estate. The water shimmered under the dying light of sunset, and she stood at the edge, her reflection rippling with the breeze. He walked up beside her, his coat brushing lightly against hers. For a long while they said nothing. "When I was younger, Clara said suddenly, her voice barely above the sound of water. "I used to think love was about saving someone, that if you cared enough you could fix what was broken. But now I know love isn't fixing. It's standing beside someone while they fix themselves." Adrian turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. And what if that person doesn't believe they're worth saving? She smiled faintly, her gaze steady. Then maybe they need someone to believe for them until they can. He didn't reply, but something in his chest tightened painfully, the kind of ache that meant he was alive again. In that moment, he wanted to tell her everything. That her presence had become his sanctuary, that her kindness had undone the walls he had built, that in her silence, he had found the voice he thought he'd lost. But he said nothing. Some truths, he realized, were too fragile to name too soon. As the evening deepened, they walked back to the manor in silence, side by side. The air between them hummed with unspoken emotion, the kind that needed no declaration. When they reached the doorway, he paused. "Clara," he said quietly, "you once told me that broken things can still be beautiful. Do you really believe that?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't just believe it," she said softly. "I live it." He nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Then maybe it's time I learned how to live it too." That night, Adrian didn't sleep. He sat by the window of his suite, watching the stars tremble above the horizon. His thoughts were heavy but not dark. For the first time in years, he was thinking not about what he had lost, but about what he might still build, not in boardrooms or skyscrapers, but in moments like these, quiet and real. Somewhere in the stillness of that night, he picked up his journal and began to write again. This time there was no bitterness in his words, only truth. Sometimes the richest man is the one who learns to feel again. And though he didn't realize it yet, that sentence would become the beginning of his redemption, and the first confession of a love he was too afraid to name, but one that had already begun to change him. Morning unfolded over Ravenshade with the quiet grace of a promise kept. The mist that had settled across the hills overnight began to lift, unveiling the slow glow of sunlight breaking through the trees. The manor, ancient yet steadfast, seemed to awaken along with the land, its ivy-clad walls shimmering faintly with dew. The faint scent of pine and earth hung in the air, mixing with the aroma of freshly brewed tea that drifted from the kitchen. For Clara Evans, it was another beginning, though she didn't yet know that this one would change everything. She stood in the garden, barefoot in the cool grass, watching the light dance upon the lake. There was peace here, but beneath it she felt a stirring, the awareness of something fragile, growing, uncertain yet undeniable. It had been weeks since Adrian Blackwood had arrived at Ravenshade, and in that time the rhythm of life had shifted like the tides. He was no longer merely a guest passing through. He had become part of the very air the place breathed. Adrian had changed in ways that even he could not fully understand. The man who had first come here haunted by his own success, by headlines and betrayals, now rose before dawn to walk the grounds as if rediscovering the world he had once ignored. He no longer carried the sharp, restless impatience of a man accustomed to commanding others. Instead, there was a quiet strength about him, a kind of grace that came only from breaking and rebuilding. He had begun helping Clara with the repairs to the old greenhouse, his once pristine hands now marked by soil and work. It amused her to see him so intent on learning simple tasks, a billionaire fumbling with wooden beams and weathered nails. But more than amusement, there was admiration, because she could see that every act, every attempt was his way of learning to live again. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the world shimmered in gold, Clara found him outside the stables repairing one of the old gates. He was bent slightly, sweat glistening at his temples, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his focus unwavering. The rhythm of his movements, patient, deliberate, honest, fascinated her. There was no trace of arrogance left in him, only humility born of loss and rediscovery. For a long moment she simply watched him, unseen, feeling the quiet pulse of something she could not name. When he finally noticed her, he straightened with a half-smile that softened the intensity of his features. "You're staring," he said lightly, though his voice carried a thread of warmth that betrayed the deeper current between them. "Maybe I'm surprised," she replied, a teasing lilt in her tone. A man who built empires now mending fences. That's not something you see every day. Adrian wiped his hands on a rag, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps this is the first honest thing I've built in years," he said. Then after a pause, "Maybe this is where building begins. Not in boardrooms or skyscrapers, but with something you can hold. Something real. Clara smiled softly, her eyes glinting with quiet pride. You sound like a man finally making peace with his hands. He laughed. Not the polished, restrained laugh of the businessman she imagined he once was, but something freer, unguarded. Maybe, he said. But I think it's your influence, not the hammers. She shook her head, brushing a stray leaf from her shoulder. You give me too much credit. No, he said simply, his voice lowering, his eyes locking with hers. I don't think I could ever give you enough. The words hung between them, unspoken emotion suspended like dust in sunlight. Clara looked away, her heart beating with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Love was a dangerous word, she reminded herself, one that had broken her once before. But this didn't feel like the kind of love that burned and consumed. It felt like warmth after a long winter, gentle and patient, waiting for her to believe in it again. In the weeks that followed, Adrian's transformation deepened. He began journaling every morning by the window, writing not of profit or markets, but of memories, mistakes, and gratitude. Sometimes he would read a few lines to Clara as they shared tea in the garden. His voice would soften as he spoke, and she would listen with a tenderness that seemed to heal the very air around them. He started taking walks through the nearby village, speaking with locals, helping repair the community library that had long been abandoned. It startled people to see him there. The elusive billionaire whose name had once filled magazines, now carrying wooden planks and painting walls beside them. Yet to Adrian it felt like redemption. Each brushstroke erased a little of the man he had been, and each smile he received reminded him that wealth was never meant to isolate, but to serve. One evening, Clara found him sitting by the lake, a small stack of envelopes beside him. The wind rippled the water, scattering fragments of moonlight across the surface. When she approached, he looked up and smiled faintly. Letters, he said, gesturing to them. To people I wronged, partners, friends, even my sister. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to write them. She sat beside him, drawing her knees close. That's brave, she said quietly. Most people run from their guilt. You're facing yours. He looked out over the lake, the reflection of the stars trembling in his eyes.
Running is what broke me, facing it.
Maybe that's what will save me. There was a silence then, long, steady, comforting. The kind that only exists between two souls who understand each other without needing to speak. She rested her hand lightly on the grass beside his, close but not touching. He noticed, and for a moment the space between their hands felt like an entire world. Fragile, electric, waiting. Clara, he said after a while, his voice barely more than a whisper. You've changed everything for me. I came here to disappear, and instead I've been found. Her breath caught, but she kept her gaze steady. You did the finding, Adrian. I only reminded you that you were still here. He turned to her fully then, the softness in his eyes deepening into something raw and real, and yet without you I might never have looked. The moonlight carved silver lines along his face, and she saw the man he had become. Not the billionaire, not the name written in glass towers, but a man stripped bare of pride, humble and human. It was then she realized she was no longer afraid. Her heart, once locked away behind walls of silence and solitude, had opened without her noticing. And though no words were spoken, both of them knew. Something sacred had begun, something that neither wealth nor tragedy could undo. The following morning, Adrian approached Clara with an idea. Ravenshade could be more than a sanctuary, he said, eyes alive with purpose. It could be a foundation, a place where people can rebuild their lives. Those who've lost everything like I did, like you once did. A refuge not just for healing, but for beginning again. Clara looked at him, astonished by the conviction in his tone. That's a beautiful dream, she said softly. But dreams like that need more than money. They need heart. He smiled, his gaze unwavering. That's why I want you to lead it with me. She froze. Me? Yes, he said. You see people for who they are, not what they've done. You don't fix them. You remind them they're not broken. You did that for me, Clara. Let's do it for others. Emotion swelled within her. Awe, disbelief, gratitude, all tangled into one. She looked away, blinking back tears she didn't want him to see. I don't know if I'm strong enough. He reached out then, not hesitating this time, his hand covering hers firmly. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. You taught me what strength really looks like. For the first time in her life, she believed it. The past she had carried like a chain began to feel like a story, one that had led her here to this moment, to this man. She met his eyes and nodded, her voice trembling but resolute. Then let's build something worth remembering. Adrian's smile was quiet but luminous, a reflection of everything he had become. Together, he said softly, we'll make Ravenshade a place where no one has to hide from themselves again. That night, as the manor lights flickered gently in the distance and the stars spilled across the velvet sky, Adrian sat once more at his desk. He opened his journal and wrote in bold, unwavering letters. Transformation is not about becoming someone new. It's about finally seeing the truth of who you were meant to be. Outside his window, Clara moved through the garden, her silhouette framed by moonlight. He watched her for a moment, his heart steady with something he hadn't felt in years: peace. In her presence, he had found not redemption from the world, but belonging within it. And though he had not yet spoken the word, he knew what it was that anchored him now. It was love, quiet, steadfast, and eternal. The seasons shifted over Ravenshade as if the very earth conspired to mirror the transformation unfolding within its walls. Summer's warmth had deepened into the russet glow of early autumn, and the hills beyond the manor blazed with copper and gold. The air carried that delicate scent of change. Wood smoke, ripened apples, the promise of something ending only so that something new might begin. Within the manor, life had taken on a rhythm that pulsed with quiet purpose. What had once been a refuge for two lost souls had become a haven for many. Word had spread softly, almost mysteriously, about the sanctuary that healed not through medicine or sermons, but through compassion, work, and human connection. People began to arrive. A soldier hollowed by war, a widow whose house had been reclaimed by debt, a young woman who had forgotten how to speak after grief stole her family. They came timidly at first, unsure what they would find, and they stayed because Adrian Blackwood and Clara Evans welcomed them not as guests, but as family. The dream that Adrian had spoken of by the lake was no longer just a dream. It was breathing. It was alive. Together, he and Clara had converted the old stables into dormitories, turned the ballroom into a workshop flooded with light, and built gardens that fed both body and spirit. The villagers who once regarded the manor as a relic now brought donations of tools and books, curious to see what kind of miracle could draw a billionaire back to earth. Adrian worked beside them every day, sleeves rolled and hands scarred from labor, no longer the distant figure who once ruled boardrooms. When the local newspaper tried to write about him, he politely refused the interview, saying only, "It isn't about me. It's about what happens when people start believing in second chances." Clara watched him change with a pride that both warmed and frightened her. There were moments when she would catch him standing in the courtyard at dusk, the wind tugging at his hair, his expression open and unguarded. In those moments she saw not the man the world once knew, but the man he had fought to become. Honest, flawed, beautifully human. And yet beneath her admiration there lingered a quiet fear. For all the good they had built, the past had a way of finding those who tried too hard to outrun it. It began with a letter, delivered one cold morning in October. Adrian found it lying on his desk, his name written in an elegant, familiar hand that made his breath catch. He recognized the handwriting before he even opened the envelope. It was from Victoria Lane, his former business partner and the woman who had once been the closest thing to love before everything fell apart. The letter was concise but heavy with implication. She had discovered new evidence that could clear his name entirely from the accusations that had shadowed his company years ago. Yet she wanted to meet in person, to discuss what it might mean for them both. Adrian sat motionless for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. When Clara found him that afternoon, he was still at the desk staring at the open window. The breeze played with the edges of the paper. She sensed immediately that something in the air had shifted. "Bad news?" she asked softly, her voice the steady calm he had come to depend on. "Not bad," he said slowly. "Just unfinished." He handed her the letter and she read it in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were steady, though a shadow flickered behind them. "She wants you to go," Clara said quietly. "And you're going to," he hesitated. "I owe it to myself, and to everyone who trusted me, to clear the truth. But I don't want to lose what we've built here. You won't, she said. The truth doesn't take away what's real. It strengthens it. Go, face her. Face it all. Her courage shamed and inspired him at once. In that moment he realized how deeply she believed in him, perhaps even more than he believed in himself. He took her hand and pressed it gently. You've become my compass, Clara, he murmured. Don't let me lose the way. She smiled faintly, though her heart tightened. Then promise you'll come back when you find what you're looking for. I already have, he said, and the quiet certainty in his tone left her breathless. 2 days later he left Ravenshade, the first real absence since his arrival. The manor felt strangely hollow without him. Clara threw herself into the work, overseeing the new arrivals, tending the gardens, and managing the endless repairs. Yet at night she would stand at the window of her small room, gazing toward the dark road that disappeared into the woods, wondering where he was and whether he still thought of her. She missed the sound of his voice, the weight of his presence, the way his laughter softened the corners of the old halls. But more than that, she feared the old world might reclaim him. Adrian's meeting with Victoria took place in London, in a glass tower that seemed colder than he remembered. The city buzzed below like a living machine, ruthless, glittering, indifferent. When he entered her office, he was struck by how little had changed. She was still poised, immaculate, a woman carved from elegance and ambition. Yet when she saw him, something in her composure faltered. You look different, she said after a long silence. Softer. I stopped fighting ghosts, he replied evenly. What did you find, Victoria? She handed him a folder, documents, statements, proof of the betrayal that had destroyed them both. Another executive, long gone, had forged signatures and hidden transactions. The truth was there in black and white. He could be vindicated, but when he closed the folder, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. You could reclaim everything, she said, searching his face. Your name, your power, and the world would welcome you back. He shook his head slowly. The world I left behind isn't the one I want anymore. She studied him for a long moment, realizing something she had perhaps always known, that the man she once desired was gone, replaced by one who no longer belonged to her glittering kingdom. There's someone else, she said finally. He didn't deny it. There is. Victoria's smile was bittersweet. Then go back to her, Adrian, whoever she is. You look alive again. When he returned to Ravenshade a week later, autumn had deepened. The trees shed their leaves in golden spirals, and the air smelled of rain and wood fire. Clara was in the garden when she saw him walking up the path, travel-worn but radiant with a peace she had never seen before. She dropped the basket in her hands and ran to meet him, every hesitation of the past dissolving in that single heartbeat. He caught her easily, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that spoke of homecoming. It's over, he whispered against her hair. The truth is out. I'm free. She pulled back just enough to look into his face. And what will you do now? He smiled, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and resolve. Now I build something that can never be destroyed, because it won't be made of money or pride. It'll be made of people, of hope. Together they walked through the grounds, the setting sun painting their path in amber light. The residents greeted him with cheers and embraces, and for the first time Adrian truly felt what it meant to belong. That night, after a dinner filled with laughter, he stood with Clara on the terrace overlooking the valley. The stars above were fierce and clear, and the wind carried the faint sound of someone playing the piano inside. Do you ever think, Adrian said softly, that all the pain we went through was just the world preparing us for this? Clara leaned against the railing, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Maybe pain isn't punishment, she said. Maybe it's instruction, teaching us how to love deeper, how to give more, how to understand what truly matters. He turned toward her, his expression tender. Then I owe my pain everything because it led me to you. The words were simple, but in them was a truth that reached beyond romance. It was an acknowledgement of everything they had survived, of every loss that had shaped them. When he kissed her then, slowly, reverently, it wasn't the beginning of something new, but the recognition of something that had always been waiting. The wind whispered through the ivy, and the manor lights glowed softly behind them, as if even the house itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Later, when the night grew quiet and the world seemed to rest in their hands, Adrian opened his journal again and wrote beneath his last entry, Awakening isn't about discovering the world. It's about remembering you were always part of it, and love. Love is the light that finally lets you see. Outside, the first frost of winter began to settle across the hills, shimmering like a promise. Ravenshade stood strong against the cold, its heart beating through every life it had gathered, every soul it had restored. And within its walls, Adrian Blackwood and Clara Evans began the next chapter, not as two people escaping their pasts, but as two hearts finally awake to the miracle of being found. Winter settled over Ravenshade not with cruelty but with an almost sacred stillness. The fields slept beneath a veil of silver frost, and the pines along the ridge whispered softly in the wind like an ancient choir. The manor glowed against the cold, every window casting a warm amber light that seemed to promise safety from the world outside. Inside, the rhythm of life continued. Fires were tended, bread baked, laughter echoed through hallways that had once known only silence. For Adrian Blackwood and Clara Evans, the months following his return were filled with work that felt larger than either of them had ever dared to imagine. What began as a sanctuary for the broken had become a movement for renewal. They called it the Ravenshade Foundation, a place where people could learn, build, and begin again. Adrian's transformation had become the heartbeat of the project. He invested not his fortune, but his faith, and the world began to notice, not through headlines or fanfare, but through whispers of lives changed. A craftsman who had lost his sight now taught woodcarving by touch. A mother who had escaped abuse ran the kitchen and sang softly as she worked. A young architect rebuilt the nearby village school with salvaged materials, designing it to catch every drop of morning light. Adrian walked among them each day, humbled by their courage. He no longer saw himself as a benefactor, but as a student learning what true wealth meant. The sharp suits and the language of mergers had been replaced by worn jackets and the language of gratitude. Clara remained the quiet center of it all. Her grace shaped the soul of Ravenshade more than any blueprint or strategy. She oversaw the counseling rooms, tended the gardens that fed everyone, and still found time to sit beside newcomers who arrived trembling with shame or fear. She never told them how to heal. She simply listened until they remembered their own strength. To those who asked how she had learned such compassion, she would smile and say, "Because someone once believed in me when I didn't." Everyone at the manor knew she meant Adrian, though she rarely spoke his name in that way. Their love was not loud or showy. It lived in glances shared across crowded rooms and small gestures, in the easy way their hands found each other when no one was watching. As winter deepened, the foundation began to expand beyond the manor walls. Letters poured in from around the country, from shelters, schools, even prisons, asking for guidance on how to build their own places of renewal. Adrian and Clara traveled to villages and cities, speaking not about charity but about dignity, not about saving lives but about helping people remember their worth. Everywhere they went, the story of Ravenshade spread like warmth in cold air. Reporters eventually came despite Adrian's resistance, and when one asked what inspired him to give everything away, he answered simply, "I was given a second chance at being human. I'm just passing it on." Yet beneath the triumph there was still fragility. Success, even the quiet kind, brings its own tests. The workload grew, and so did the expectations. Adrian sometimes pushed himself until exhaustion blurred his focus. One night, Clara found him alone in his study. The fire burned low and unread letters scattered around him. He looked up, eyes shadowed with fatigue and doubt. "What if I can't keep it together?" he said quietly. "What if all of this depends on me being stronger than I am?" She walked to him without hesitation and placed her hands on his shoulders. "It doesn't depend on strength," she said softly. "It depends on honesty. You don't have to hold everything. Let others help carry it." Then, lowering her voice even further, she added, "Let me carry it with you." That moment became the turning point of their partnership. Adrian began to trust others to lead, to let the foundation grow through shared purpose rather than control. Clara became his mirror in every decision, reminding him that the measure of success was not numbers or buildings, but hearts restored. Together they rewrote what power meant, not dominance but service, not perfection but presence. Spring returned at last, washing away the long white hush of winter. Ravenshade burst into color, wildflowers blanketing the hillsides, birds weaving songs through the open windows. On the anniversary of the foundation's first year, the entire valley gathered at the manor. Former residents returned, bringing their families, their laughter, their gratitude. The courtyard was strung with lights, and the air smelled of bread, rain, and blooming lilacs. Adrian stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Clara moved among the guests, her smile lighting the dusk more brightly than any lantern. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had found her place in the world. And he realized that she was the truest symbol of everything Ravenshade stood for. When the music softened and the crowd fell still, he stepped forward to speak. The hum of the evening faded into silence as he looked out at the faces before him. So many stories, so many rebirths. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady, "this place was only stone and memory. Today it is alive because each of you brought your pain here and turned it into something sacred. We didn't build a refuge, we built a beginning. If I've learned anything, it's that legacy isn't what you leave behind in buildings or wealth. Legacy is the lives that keep growing long after you're gone." He paused then, his eyes finding Clara's across the courtyard. "And if this place ever stands for anything, let it stand for this, that love in its purest form is the courage to start again." Applause rose like thunder, but Clara didn't move toward him until the noise faded. Then she crossed the courtyard and reached him quietly, her expression shining with tears she didn't try to hide. "You've given them hope," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "We did." And in that moment, surrounded by everything they had rebuilt, they shared a kiss that carried no urgency, only the calm certainty of two lives fully aligned. Years later, long after the world had changed again and both their hair had silvered, the manor still stood at the edge of the highlands, its gardens alive, its rooms filled with laughter. Adrian wrote one final entry in his journal before handing it to a young apprentice who had come to learn at Ravenshade. The handwriting had grown slower but no less sure. "Legacy is not the echo of your name. It is the garden that grows from the kindness you plant. Once I thought I needed to be remembered. Now I know I only needed to love well." When the apprentice asked him what that meant, Adrian smiled faintly and nodded toward Clara, who was tending roses by the window. "It means everything begins there," he said. That night, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the first stars flickered awake, Ravenshade glowed once more like a lantern against the dark, a living symbol of forgiveness, resilience, and the infinite grace of two hearts that had learned not just to love, but to heal the world through it. And somewhere, carried on the wind that moved through the heathered fields, one could almost hear the echo of Adrian's whisper to Clara, the same promise he had made years ago by the firelight. "You taught me that broken things can still be beautiful. Now look how beautifully the world has broken open." And with that, the story of Ravenshade, of Adrian Blackwood and Clara Evans, of loss transformed into legacy, lived on, not in books or monuments, but in every soul who found the courage to begin again. End of story.